Good morning, everyone. Today's shir is Moreh Nevukhim, Section 1, Chapter 28. We are broadcasting from the webyeshiva.org Facebook page. This is a live shir from Thornhill, Ontario, where we study Moreh Nevukhim every Monday morning at approximately 7:30 in the morning Eastern Time. Today, we are using, as we always do, the Pines edition of the Moreh Nevukhim translation. We have a few extra copies if anyone would like. And we also have a handout today, which you can find on the Facebook page, Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. The title of today's shir is God's Foot and Throne and Prime Matter. God's Foot and Throne and Prime Matter. Okay. Now, Miriam had asked if I could say when I'm going to be away. I leave on February 13th, and I'm back, I believe, on the 26th. So that means that we're going to be missing, I believe, 2 Moreh Nevukhim Mondays in February. So next week we are definitely meeting. The week after that we're going to be meeting. And I think it's the following week after that we're not meeting. Okay. Just to put us in our context, last week we saw chapter 27 where we learned a very important principle on the issue of removing anthropomorphic descriptions from Hashem and Onkelos' project. The Rambam views himself as the heir to Onkelos in trying to remove any corporeality from God. And as such, he uses Onkelos sort of as his proof that this is a project that is not something that I've just started. This is a project that has been ongoing for centuries. And he pointed out something quite curious, and that is that whereas Onkelos always retranslates a pasuk to remove any sense of physical attributes to God, there are a couple of places where he doesn't. So for example, when God promised Yaakov in a vision that I will go down to Egypt with you, he did not translate it as that the essence of God or the Shekhinah of God will go down with you, but I, God myself, I will go down with you. And the reason is, says the Rambam, because when it comes to a vision, especially an inferior prophetic vision, a prophet is given to misunderstand the metaphor that he is seeing, or really to not really appreciate that the vision that he's having of a completely infinite and non-corporeal God might appear in the vision as corporeal on some level. And that's due to the prophet's sort of limited scope of vision, okay? And therefore, in order to describe the limited scope of vision that Yaakov was having at that night vision that he had, it describes that God appeared to Yaakov on some corporeal level, even though God has no corporeal attributes. But it was Yaakov's vision, his epistemological limitations, that created that misunderstanding. And that's what Onkelos is therefore trying to capture when he describes God literally as the way that the pasuk did. Okay, now here I believe that this is the connection now to chapter 28, because we're going to see that the Rambam has the opportunity, and Onkelos has the opportunity to do the very same thing here, but does not, and we'll have to try and understand why that is. So he starts off by talking about the foot, the word foot, where it appears in Tanakh, and how it pertains to God. So he starts off by saying, this is on page 59 in the Pines edition of the guide, foot or regel in Hebrew is an equivocal term, which means it can mean different things depending upon the context. The first, most basic way to understand the word regel is that it means literally a foot of a human being. So therefore, as the pasuk says in Exodus chapter 21, regel tachas regel. God says, you injure someone else's foot, the penalty is your foot, a foot for a foot, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. And we know, of course, that's not the literal meaning, but at least that's what the word foot means in that pasuk. It also occurs with the following meaning. For example, go out and all of the people that are in your foot So this is Moshe Rabbeinu, actually in this week's Parsha, Parshat Bo, speaking to Paro. And it's a very emotional Parsha, very dramatic Parsha. So Moshe says to Paro, V'yoredu chol avodecha eila elai, all of your servants will come to me and they will bow down to me, saying, Tzei ata v'chol ha'am asher biraglecha. You, Moshe, leave. In other words, we're anxious for you to leave. And all of the nation that is at your feet. What does it mean, all of the nation that is at your feet? The meaning of which is those people who follow you. When someone is at my foot, it means that they're one of my followers. And that's really what another meaning of foot is, that it is the part, it implies that if someone is at a foot, it means they are following the other person with the other person. And it is likewise used in the sense of causation. Now here's the third meaning. It means that the word foot is almost used as a siba, as a reason for. You can use the word regel as saying the cause of A is the cause of X, A is the regel of X, or A is the regel of B, I should say. Thus, and the Lord has blessed you for my foot. So where does that pasuk appear? So this is Lavan speaking to Yaakov Avinu in Genesis chapter 30. I'm sorry, this is Yaakov's rather speaking to Lavan. He basically, Yaakov says to Lavan, Ki ma'at asher haya lecha lefanai vayifrotz larov. He says, the small amount of wealth that you had when I got here has increased exponentially since I've been here for the last 20 years. Vayivarech Hashem osecha liragli. God, says Yaakov, blessed you, Lavan, liragli, because of me. So the word regel, liragli, is because of me. Okay? I being the cause, it is to say for my sake. For when a thing exists for the sake of some other thing, the latter is the cause of the former. So all of your wealth is liragli, because of me. Now, if you take a look at the Rashbam's commentary on that pasuk, you'll see that he says the same thing, liragli bishvili, because of me. And we find a similar usage in the very next example that the Rambam gives. And this is in Genesis chapter 33. And here, instead of Yaakov speaking to Lavan, he is now speaking to Esav. And the meaning, so thus, for the foot of the cattle that goes before me, and for the foot of the children. Now, he says, Ya'avor na Adoni lifnei avdo. Esav says, let's travel together. And Yaakov says, you know what? It's not going to work. You better go ahead of me, because I have to lead my entourage very slowly. L'regel hamelacha asher lefanai u'leregel hayeladim. Because of the great work that it will take to lead the cattle, the livestock, and because of the children. And here Yaakov once again uses the word regel. I found a very interesting sefer called Kometz HaMincha by Rav Chanoch Ehrentrau, who was a great dayan of our generation. And he writes as follows. He says, Lavan had acknowledged that Yaakov was the cause of much of his blessing, but he didn't use the word regel. He used the word biglalecha. That if you notice, I don't have the pasuk, but I quoted his commentary in source number 6. Lavan acknowledged, Vayivorecheni Hashem biglalecha, that God has blessed me because of you. So he asked an interesting question. What is the difference between the word liragli and biglalecha? Because of me and because of you, they seem to mean the same thing. But Lavan, why does Lavan use a different word? So he writes that there are different kinds of causalities that are discussed, in mathematics and logic and philosophical terminology. You can have something called a necessary causality, a sufficient causality, a possible causality. There's, in Aristotle use the term efficient cause, which is the most direct cause of something's occurring. If X was necessary in order for Y to come into existence, that's a necessary cause. And that's when we would use the word regel, says Rabbi Ehrentreu. However, To say biglalecha means that it's because of you, but not necessarily because of you. There may have been a number of factors that went into my success as Lavan. You might have come to my home at exactly the time when the stock market was just experiencing an uptick. So biglalecha doesn't mean that it's exclusively and necessarily because of you, but it means that you were a sufficient cause or a possible cause for my wealth. And therefore Lavan was belittling Yaakov once again. Yes, it's true. All the years that you've been here, I've seen a great increase, but there's not necessarily a direct correlation between your presence here and the increase of my life. Like, it's happened somewhat because of you, because you've been working in the field, but who knows what other causes. And it's just an interesting aside that the difference between regel and biglal, leregel and biglal. Okay, now let's go to the main event. Now let's talk about the word regel as it is used in the context of God. And accordingly, now we have a pasuk in Zechariah, and this is in source number 7 in your sheet. Ve'amdu raglav bayom hahu al har hazeitim asher al pnei Yerushalayim mikedem. That in the messianic apocalyptic vision that Zechariah has, he writes, about this right before the Messiah comes. God's feet will stand on that day on the Mount of Olives, which is to the east of Jerusalem. Now, let me see, how many of you remember us having this pasuk before in a previous chapter of Moreh Nevukhim, where we talked about a verb that appears in this pasuk that also seems to anthropomorphize God. Stand, very good. So turn back to chapter 13 for just a second. Chapter 13 is on page 39 and 40 in the Pines edition. And he quoted on page 40, he quoted that very pasuk, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. And the function of the Rambam quoting that pasuk in chapter 13 was to talk about the verb amidah, standing, and how it pertains to a God who has no legs on which to stand and is not and is non-corporeal. So when the Tanakh uses the word stand in reference to God, it means that God's commands will be established, which means a lot of times God says something will come to fruition and it takes a very long time for that promise to be fulfilled. So when it says v'amdu, that they will stand, it means that will be the day when God's promise to redeem the Jewish people will come to be. His words will stand on that day, is what it means. But what does it mean that God's feet will stand? That's what we have to explain now. So we had an allusion to that in chapter 13, but now he's going to go into it a little bit more in depth. It signifies thereby the establishment of things that he has caused. I mean, of the wonders that will then become manifest at that place, and of which God, may he be exalted, is the cause, I mean the maker. And therefore what it means is that God's raglayim, God's legs, or God's causes that he brings into existence will have permanence on that day. All of the miracles that God promised that he would bring, those miracles are his raglayim, are the causes that he said will be the things that will bring about the great redemption. Okay, so that's what the word raglav means in that pasuk. This interpretation was adopted by Yonasan ben Uziel, peace be upon him, and therefore he translates as follows. And if you take a look at source number 7, I have the Targum Yonatan in the original Aramaic, V'yitgalei b'givurtei b'idana hahi, that God will be revealed in his might. In other words, all of the causes that God brings to exist in this world that will bring about his objective shall be manifest on that day, al tur zeta dal ape Yerushalayim, upon the Mount of Olives. And as he says, he will manifest himself in his might on that day. In a similar way, he translates every part of the body having the function of, I'm not really happy with Pines' translation, having the function of action or motion is really the way that you should translate. In other words, every part of the body that is described about God that describes either action or motion, he describes in the same way by the terms, really the might of God. For all of them are intended to signify actions proceeding from God's will. Physical phenomena occur in this world, and that's called God's gevura. And it's also called, in the text, the regel of God, or the action of God, or in wherever the context appears in Tanakh. Now, this leads us to a pasuk, which once again we have already discussed, but we're going to discuss it in a new way. And it is the event that takes place at Mount Sinai and appears in Parshat Mishpatim in the book of Exodus. The Torah tells us in Exodus chapter 24, source number 8, Vayal Moshe v'Aaron Nadav Avihu b'shivim meziknei Yisrael. Moshe, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel ascend Mount Sinai. And the Torah relates, Vayiru eit Elokei Yisrael. They saw the God of Israel. V'tachat raglav, and beneath his feet, Kema'asei livnat sapir, was like the product of sapphire stone, or some kind of handiwork of sapphire stone, uche'etzem hashamayim latohar, and the essence of the heavens in its purity. Okay, so that's literally what the Torah is describing, is the vision that these elders gazed upon when they were ascending Mount Sinai. Now, where did we see this before? We saw this before. Anyone that want
to see God?
To see God, and in what context was the Rambam discussing seeing God? He was in, if you go back to chapter 5 now, okay, here the Rambam talked about the inability for a human being to correctly understand or apprehend God in his true essence. And a person requires a tremendous amount of preparation, of intellectual and spiritual preparation, in order to be able to properly apprehend a vision of the Almighty. So this is on pages 29 and 30, where the Rambam talked about this idea. And he actually quotes this whole pasuk about where they gazed upon God, that they had some kind of vision which was anthropomorphized because of their failure to properly understand it. And this is really falls right into the hands of what we were discussing last time, is that if a person does not have a high level of prophecy, many times they will see something that appears to be of a physical nature, but is really not, but it's only due to their lack of prophetic preparation, lack of perfection of prophecy, that they're not able to properly understand it. And that's why the Rambam wrote that right after they had this vision, Vayochlu Vayishtu, it says that they ate and drank because they related it to the physical in an inappropriate way. And so that's why he writes, he says, the nobles of the children of Israel, on the other hand, were over hasty, strained their thoughts, and achieved the apprehension, but only an imperfect one. Okay? So this was the Rambam wrote that these words are solely intended to present a criticism of their act of seeing, not to describe the manner of their seeing. Okay? In other words, there was too much corporeality in what they apprehended. Now let's see how the Rambam is going to explain it over here. Because surprisingly, even though he could say that they had a purely corporeal vision due to the deficiency of their prophetic powers, nevertheless, he's going to show us that Onkelos does not translate it that way. The interpretation is, as you know, of Onkelos, as you know, is as follows. He considers that the third person suffix his in the word his feet refers to God's throne. In other words, he does not translate that they saw the God of Israel and underneath God's feet were these rocks or stones of sapphire. But rather when it says V'tachat raglav, Onkelos translates it as underneath the feet of God's throne. He puts in the word throne when that does not appear in the pasuk. So if you take a look at Targum Onkelos in source number 8, V'chazu yat yekar elakadi Yisrael. First he writes, they saw the glory of the God of Israel. Not God himself, but the glory of God. So again, Onkelos is distancing the actual, any kind of anthropomorphic qualities to God, because they see some kind of manifestation of God, not God himself. V'tachat kurse yikare, and underneath the throne of his glory. How do we say that in Hebrew? The throne of his glory? No, we say kisei hakavod. We say kisei hakavod. We say, and that's a very common term. We say underneath the throne of his glory was ka'ovid even tava, was like that handiwork of precious stones. Okay? So the Onkelos is going to great extent. Number one, he's talking about the glory of God, not God himself. And he's talking about the throne. The word regel means underneath the feet of the throne, not underneath the feet of the glory of God, but underneath the throne of the glory of God. So distancing any kind of connection to God himself even further. So, yes, Howard.
Even throne denotes something that you sit upon. So here, I think even that in the context is more of a kingship or superiority of his greatness over us, rather than more even a physical throne.
Yes, of course it has to be. But remember, the point is that Onkelos is taking two steps to remove any connection to God himself. Number one, he's talking about the glory of God, not of God. And number two, he's saying that underneath his feet does not refer to underneath the feet of God's glory, but underneath the feet of the throne of God's glory. So two steps removed. So his point is as follows. He considers that the third person suffix his in the words his feet refers to God's throne. And so he translates, and under the throne of his glory. Understand this and admire how far Onkelos was from belief in the corporeality of God and from everything that leads to it, even though it be by the longest way. In other words, even though he's got to go out of his way and go like this, to scratch his ear, to translate the pasuk, nevertheless, that's the way, to the extent he goes. For he does not say, and under his throne, for should the term throne have been referred to God in the sense that has been explained above, this would have entailed the consequence that he would have been conceived of as sitting upon a body, and thus would have entailed the belief in corporeality, as Howard, you correctly pointed out. Accordingly, Onkelos referred the term throne to his glory, the Shekhinah, which is a created light. Similarly, he renders in his translation the verse, and kiyad al kes ka. So another pasuk, that God places his hand on his throne, swearing that there shall be a war with Amalek from generation to generation, not God saying, my hand is upon the throne, but from God whose indwelling is on the throne of glory. In other words, whenever we see a reference to a kisei in reference to God, Onkelos always will translate that not that God is sitting on the throne, but the glory of God is sitting on the throne. And in a similar way, you find on the tongue of the whole nation. That's why we say in the vernacular, kisei hakavod. In other words, the throne of the glory of God, not of God himself. Once again, to remove any sense of corporeality from God. Okay? Now, the question, of course, is, why couldn't Onkelos just say, well, they had an imperfect vision. So their vision of God was that he was sitting on a throne. And the answer seems to be, is that Onkelos will only do that when the vision is not so graphic as the way it's being described here. When God says to Yaakov in a night vision, I will go down with you to Egypt, there's no graphic sense of the image of a God riding on a donkey going down to Egypt. But here, where the pasuk is so graphic in detailing what actually they're seeing, even Onkelos, who says that an inferior prophet will sometimes anthropomorphize and give physical attributes to the vision that he is seeing, does not want to do that in a case where the vision is so clearly described in the pasuk. So therefore, it's necessary for Onkelos to say that we understand that God is non-corporeal, that what they saw, regardless of what they thought they saw, but what they really saw was God Shechina, a created essence of God, seated on a throne that is also a creation of God, and underneath the feet were this handiwork of sapphire stones. Now, we're going to get into a discussion of what these stones are, and I want us to be able to look into that carefully. We may have to wait until next week before we get to that. I just want to get to the bottom of the page, and then maybe we'll end it there. And then next week we'll get into a discussion about what these actual stones are. What is this vision that they're having, and why is it relevant? Now he says, we have gone beyond the subject of the chapter in order to deal with a matter that will be made clear in other chapters. Now what will be made clear in other chapters? In chapter 64 of our section, the Rambam will explain what the word kavod, glory, means, and he'll go into a very lengthy exposition as what the word, where we find the word kavod, the glory. And in chapter 70 of this section, he will explain the term kisei and merkava, the throne of God and the chariot of God. Those are terms that we're going to get to. He says, I've only touched on these terms. I will now return to the subject of this chapter. As for the interpretation of Onkelos, you already know it. However, the final end of the matter, meaning what was Onkelos' whole objective in really retooling the translation of this pasuk, consists in the rejection of the doctrine of the corporeality of God. Chuck just gave a lecture on Friday night about those who did believe in the corporeality of God. You can speak to him about it, but clearly the Rambam is polemicizing throughout this sefer against that belief. He does not explain to us what they apprehended and what is intended by this parable. In other words, Onkelos has a particular project. His particular project is, I am translating the Torah for the common man. I have a responsibility when I translate the Torah. I need to make sure that the reader will not misunderstand God's essence, God as he truly is. I do not have the responsibility to provide further midrashic material to the reader to give a more clear exposition on all of the different terminologies of the Torah. And that's what the Rambam is pointing out. This was Onkelos' project. He acts in a similar way in all other passages. That is to say, he's not concerned with such significations. What does it mean that under God's feet was the handiwork of sapphire and the essence of the heavens in its purity? But only with the rejection of the doctrine of the corporeality of God. For this rejection is a matter of demonstration and is necessary in belief. Meaning it's dogmatic, that if in order to be a believing Jew, you, according to the Rambam, you cannot believe in God's corporeality. It's dogma. It is essential for a Jew to believe this. But so therefore, he made a decision about it and translated it accordingly. On the other hand, the explanation of the meaning of parables is a supposititious matter, which means it's speculative. What does the sapphire bricks that they saw, what is it really referring to? Well, it could mean A, it could mean B, it could mean C. Onkelos says, not my problem. That's not my job. That's not my job is to make sure that you understand God in a way that will not make you a heretic. But as far as what those sapphire bricks are, I have no responsibility, because if you interpret it as A when it really should have been interpreted as B, that doesn't make you a heretic. But if I don't present you a clear vision of what God is in the pasuk, then possibly I might be helping you, aiding you to have a heretical view of God. Okay. They are also most hidden matters, and it is not a part of the foundations of belief to understand them, nor are they easily grasped by the multitude. And furthermore, says the Rambam, if Onkelos is translating this for the everyman, for the common Jew on the street, then it is further not only not his job to do it, but it is inappropriate for him to translate and unpack very mysterious issues that perhaps are not meant for the average person who's reading the Chumash to understand. They have to be delved into carefully. And if my translation is going to be read by the masses, maybe there are certain things that I should not be exposing to them. And hence, Onkelos did not concern himself with their signification. And that's the reason why Onkelos didn't bother explaining what that sapphire brickwork actually is. But since I, the Rambam, am writing a different kind of book from Onkelos, even though last chapter I said that I am an heir of Onkelos's project, but I'm not totally an heir of Onkelos's project. Onkelos was writing his translation for the common folk. Moreh Nevukhim, you're a philosopher. You are a deep thinker if you've already picked up this sefer. And therefore, it is my responsibility to not only be in accord with Onkelos to make sure that you understand that God does not sit on a throne, but also I need to explain to you what is this sapphire brickwork using philosophical concepts that will carefully explain to you what really, when we get into the nitty-gritty of what everything is, what the world is created from, that's going to be the vision of the sapphire brickwork. And that, says the Rambam, I'm going to tell you now, but we're not going to have time to look at that right now. We'll save that in Mirz Hashem for next week. Okay? Any questions, comments? Okay.